The heavy oak door slammed with a thunderous bang that echoed through the marble foyer of the Northbrook mansion. Steve Anderson winced, not from the sound, but from the realization that nanny number 19 had just stormed out. 6 months, 19 nannies, 0 solutions. "Good riddance," yelled 6-year-old Emma from the top of the grand staircase, her blonde pigtails bouncing with defiance. Beside her, her identical brothers Max and Leo high-fived each other, spat their cherubic faces masking the chaos they so expertly created. "We win again!" Leo shouted, his blue eyes twinkling with mischief. Steve ran his hands through his salt and pepper hair, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. At 42, he had built Anderson Technologies into one of Chicago's most successful tech companies, amassed a fortune most could only dream of, but couldn't manage to keep a nanny for more than a week. "Kids, please," he pleaded, his voice carrying the weight of a man at his breaking point. This isn't a game. But to Emma, Max, and Leo, it was exactly that. A game they were determined to win, regardless of the cost. The triplets had earned quite the reputation throughout Chicago's affluent North Shore community. "Demon children," whispered the mothers at the elite private school they attended. "Impossible," declared the string of child-care professionals who had tried and failed to tame them. But beneath their calculated tantrums and booby-trapped bedrooms lay 3 broken hearts, still bleeding from a wound that had never properly healed. 2 years ago, Catherine Anderson, devoted mother, beloved wife, and the glue that held their family together, had been taken from them in a car accident on Lakeshore Drive. In the blink of an eye, their world had shattered. Steve buried himself in work, leaving a rotating door of nannies to pick up the pieces. The triplets, too young to process their grief, channeled it into rebellion. "Sir?" The voice of Mrs. Winters, his long-suffering housekeeper, pulled Steve from his thoughts. "The agency called? They're sending someone tomorrow morning." Steve laughed bitterly. "And how long do you think this one will last? An hour? Maybe 2 if we're lucky?" Mrs. Winters, who had been with the family since before the triplets were born, fixed him with a pointed stare. "They say this one's different. They always say that," Steve muttered, heading toward his home office where a mountain of work awaited. It was easier to focus on quarterly reports than the mess his family had become. The next morning, as dawn broke over Lake Michigan and painted the Chicago skyline in hues of gold, Margaret Belinda Jefferson stood at the wrought iron gates of the Anderson estate. At 35, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied the storms she had weathered. Her dark skin glowed in the morning light, and her closely cropped natural hair framed a face that had learned early how to mask pain with resolve. She'd heard the whispers about the Anderson triplets. The child care agency had been brutally honest. No one wanted this job. 19 nannies in 6 months, a record even for the notoriously difficult placements they handled for Chicago's elite. "You don't have to take this one, Margaret," her supervisor had said, concern evident in her voice. "We have other families." "I'll take it," Margaret had interrupted, her voice firm. She needed this job, needed the substantial salary it offered. More than that, something about these children called to her. Maybe it was because she understood loss in a way few others did. As the gates swung open and she made her way up the curved driveway, Margaret straightened her simple navy dress and took a deep breath. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Child, sometimes the most broken people are just waiting for someone patient enough to pick up their pieces." The mansion loomed before her, an imposing structure of limestone and glass that spoke of old money and new success. Before she could ring the bell, the door swung open to reveal a harried-looking man in an expensive suit, phone pressed to his ear. Steve Anderson's eyes widened slightly as he took in the woman standing on his doorstep. He'd expected another fresh-faced college graduate or middle-aged suburban mom looking for part-time work. Not this woman with eyes that seemed to look straight through him. "I'll call you back," he said abruptly into the phone before extending his hand. "Steve Anderson, you must be from the agency." Margaret's handshake was firm. "Margaret Jefferson, though most people call me Belinda." Well, Miss Jefferson, I should warn you. A blood-curdling scream from inside the house cut him off. Steve closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. That would be Emma, he explained. The boys have probably put something in her bed. Again. Margaret didn't flinch. May I come in, Mr. Anderson? I believe I'm already on the clock. Steve stepped aside, a mix of skepticism and desperate hope on his face. By all means, though I should warn you, the record for shortest employment was 43 minutes. The Triplets have a betting pool going. A small smile touched Margaret's lips. I don't much care for records, Mr. Anderson, or betting pools. As she stepped into the foyer, 3 blonde heads peered down at her from the landing above. The Triplets had perfected the art of looking innocent while plotting mayhem. Max clutched a remote control behind his back, while Leo held what appeared to be a jar of something sticky. Emma, still in her pajamas, wore an expression that could only be described as evaluative. Children, Steve called up. This is Miss Jefferson. She'll be your new nanny. Until lunchtime, maybe, Max whispered to his siblings, but in the grand acoustics of the foyer, his words carried clearly. Margaret looked up at them, her gaze steady and unperturbed. I was thinking more along the lines of until you 3 graduate college, but we can discuss timelines later. The Triplets exchanged glances. This wasn't the reaction they were used to. Steve checked his watch. I have meetings all day. Mrs. Winters will show you around and explain the routines. Kids, behave, please. The plea in his voice made it clear he expected anything but. As he rushed out the door, Margaret turned her attention fully to the 3 children still watching her from above. Now then, she said calmly, setting her bag down, which one of you is going to show me where the cleaning supplies are kept? I suspect we'll need them shortly. Leo's jaw dropped slightly. Aren't you scared? Margaret tilted her head. Of 3 6-year-olds? Should I be? We made our last nanny cry, Emma declared proudly. And the one before that quit after Max put a frog in her coffee, Leo added. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. I see. Well, I don't scare easily, and I happen to like frogs. Now, I believe you have school today. Who's going to show me where your uniforms are kept? For the first time in months, the Anderson triplets found themselves at a loss. This wasn't going according to their usual script. By mid-morning, Margaret had navigated her first series of triplet-engineered disasters with unflappable calm. The sudden malfunction of the kitchen sink that soaked her dress was met with a simple, I always pack a spare outfit. Clever thinking, though. The disappearance of the car keys just before school drop-off was countered with, that's fine. It's a beautiful day for a walk. Even the classic thumbtack on the chair trick in the kitchen received only an observant, I see you've been studying basic defense mechanisms. Interesting choice. Each time their schemes failed to produce the desired meltdown, the triplets' frustration grew. By the time she picked them up from school that afternoon, they were ready to escalate. You know she won't last, Emma whispered to her brothers as they piled into the back of the car. Nobody does. Max nodded, a jar of spiders hidden in his backpack. Phase 2 begins after dinner. What the children didn't realize was that Margaret's hearing was exceptional. As she drove them home through Chicago's upscale streets, she observed them in the rearview mirror. 3 beautiful children with hollow eyes and defensive postures. She recognized the signs. She'd seen them in the mirror often enough after her own world had collapsed. After dinner, which passed with suspicious cooperation from the triplets, Margaret announced, I think we should have a movie night. We're not babies, Max scoffed. Never said you were, Margaret replied evenly. I just thought you might enjoy Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, but if you'd rather go to bed early... The mention of spiders made Max's eyes widen. His hand instinctively went to his backpack where his jar of 8-legged ammunition waited. Why would you want to watch a movie with us? Leo asked suspiciously. Because I like movies, and I suspect you 3 are pretty good company when you're not planning warfare. Emma crossed her arms. Our mom used to do movie nights. The room fell silent. It was the first time any of them had mentioned Catherine since Margaret's arrival. Did she? Margaret asked softly. What else did she do with you? The question hung in the air, dangerously close to the grief they all worked so hard to avoid. For a moment, Margaret thought she'd pushed too far too soon. Then Leo said quietly, "She made us hot chocolate with tiny marshmallows. And she let us build a blanket fort in the living room," added Emma. Max remained silent, but his hand moved away from his backpack. "Well," Margaret said, "I make pretty mean hot chocolate myself, and I've been told my blanket fort architecture is structurally sound." An hour later, Steve returned home to find his formal living room transformed. Blankets stretched from sofa to chairs, creating a sprawling fort lit from within by string lights. The sounds of a movie and, most shocking of all, children's laughter emanated from inside. He stood frozen in the doorway, briefcase still in hand, as the scent of chocolate wafted through the air. It had been so long since laughter had echoed through these rooms that he almost didn't recognize the sound. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of mugs, stopping short when she saw him. "Mr. Anderson, I hope you don't mind the restructuring of your living room. It's temporary." Steve stared at her, then at the fort where his children were actually enjoying themselves rather than plotting destruction. "How did you?" Margaret shrugged. "Sometimes children just need someone to see past what they're showing to what they're feeling." She hesitated, then added, "There's extra hot chocolate if you'd care to join us." For the first time in years, Steve set aside his work without a second thought and crawled into the blanket fort beside his children. Days passed, then weeks. The triplets' sabotage attempts grew half-hearted, then sporadic, then ceased altogether. Not because they had accepted Margaret, but because she had proven impossible to rattle. When they flooded the bathroom, she turned it into a lesson about water displacement. When they short-sheeted her bed, she complimented their hospital corners. When they released a garden snake in the kitchen, she named it Herbert and helped them build a proper terrarium. But it wasn't just Margaret's immunity to their tricks that began to wear down their defenses. It was the way she listened, really listened when they spoke. The way she noticed things. That Emma only pretended to hate dolls because she feared getting attached to anything again. That Leo's aggression masked a deep-seated fear that he wasn't strong enough to protect what remained of his family. That Max's pranks were a desperate bid for the attention his father rarely gave. One afternoon, as they walked home from school through Lincoln Park, Leo asked the question they'd all been wondering. "Why aren't you afraid of us like everyone else?" Margaret considered this as they passed the zoo. "I suppose because I understand what it's like to be afraid of losing something else." The children exchanged glances. This was new territory. "What did you lose?" Emma asked hesitantly. Margaret was quiet for so long they thought she might not answer. "My daughter," she finally said. "Her name was Zoe. She was just a little younger than you when she got sick." The triplets stopped walking, their eyes wide. "What happened to her?" Max asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Cancer," Margaret said simply. "It was very quick. After that, I lost my marriage too. Grief does that sometimes, pulls people apart instead of pushing them together." "Our mom died in a car crash," Leo said suddenly. "Dad never talks about it." Margaret nodded. "That must be very hard." "He put away all her pictures," Emma added, her voice small. "Like she never existed." Margaret knelt down on the sidewalk, looking each child in the eye. Sometimes, when people are hurting very badly, they think if they hide everything that reminds them of their pain, it will go away. But that's not how grief works. It needs air and light to heal, just like a cut. "Is that why you're not scared of us?" Max asked. "Because you lost someone too?" "That's part of it," Margaret admitted. "The other part is that I see three incredible, smart, creative children who are hurting and don't know how to say so." That night, while the triplets slept, Margaret found Steve in his study, buried in work as usual. Without preamble, she said, "They need to talk about their mother, Mr. Anderson." Steve's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" "Your children. They're acting out because they're grieving and don't know how to process it. Neither do you, from what I can see." Anger flashed across Steve's face. "You're overstepping, Miss Jefferson." Probably, she agreed. But those children are drowning in grief that has nowhere to go. They destroyed 19 nannies because they're terrified of loving someone who might leave. Just like their mother did. Just like you have, emotionally. Steve stood abruptly. That's enough. No, it's not, Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. Your children told me today that you removed all photographs of their mother. That you never speak of her. Do you know what message that sends to them? That the person they loved most in the world is too painful to remember. Which makes them wonder, if they died, would you erase them too? Steve sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. I can't, he whispered. I can't look at her face every day and keep functioning. Then you'll lose them too, Margaret said simply. Not to death, but to the belief that their pain matters less than yours. She left him alone with that thought, closing the door quietly behind her. The next morning, Margaret woke to find the triplets huddled outside her bedroom door, their faces serious. We need your help, Emma declared. Over breakfast, they outlined their plan. They wanted to celebrate their mother's birthday, something that hadn't happened since her death. They wanted to bake her favorite cake, look at old photos, and visit her favorite spot in the botanic garden. But Dad won't want to, Leo said glumly. He might surprise you, Margaret replied. Sometimes people just need permission to remember. That evening, when Steve returned home, he found the dining room transformed. Photos of Catherine that had been stored away in boxes now lined the walls. A chocolate cake, lopsided but made with obvious care, sat in the center of the table. The triplets stood nervously beside it, dressed in their best clothes. What is this? Steve asked, his voice strangled. Happy birthday to Mom, Max said hesitantly. Steve stared at the photos of his late wife, Catherine laughing on their wedding day, cradling newborn triplets, building sand castles at Oak Street Beach. The grief he'd worked so hard to contain threatened to overwhelm him. We thought, Emma's voice faltered, we thought maybe we could remember her together. For a moment, no one moved. Then Steve dropped to his knees and opened his arms. The triplets rushed into his embrace, and for the first time since Catherine's death, they cried together as a family. From the doorway, Margaret watched silently. This was why she had come here. Not just for a job, but because somehow she had known these children needed what only she could give them. Understanding born from similar pain. 3 months after Margaret arrived at the Anderson home, the transformation was remarkable. The demon triplets still had their moments of mischief, but the malice was gone, replaced by the normal high spirits of children who felt secure. Steve had emerged from his fog of grief and work, becoming present in his children's lives in a way he hadn't been since Catherine's death. As for Margaret, she had given the Andersons more than stability. She had given them permission to heal. In doing so, she had begun to heal herself. But not everyone was pleased with this development. Across town, in a sleek downtown apartment, Victor Reynolds seethed as he read the text message from his spy in the Anderson household, Mrs. Winters, who had been feeding him information in hopes of advancing her nephew's position at Anderson Technologies. The family is fully functional now. The new nanny has fixed everything. Deal likely off the table. Victor slammed his phone down in frustration. For months, he had been positioning himself to take advantage of Steve's distraction, slowly manipulating things toward a merger that would effectively give him control of Anderson Technologies. Steve's personal chaos had been Victor's greatest asset. With the CEO too overwhelmed by his home life to focus properly on business, Victor's carefully planted suggestions had nearly succeeded in pushing Steve toward a disastrous partnership. Now this nanny, this Margaret Jefferson, had ruined everything by stabilizing the household. Who is she? Victor muttered, opening his laptop to dig deeper. What he found surprised him. Margaret Belinda Jefferson had once been Dr. Margaret Jefferson, a respected child psychologist specializing in grief counseling. Her career had derailed after her daughter's death and subsequent divorce, when a malpractice suit from a former patient, secretly funded by her vindictive ex-husband, had destroyed her professional reputation. Victor smiled slowly as a plan formed. If Margaret Jefferson had secrets in her past, perhaps they could be leveraged. One phone call to the right tabloid journalist. One whispered a rumor about the nanny with the checkered past, caring for Chicago's most vulnerable children. The headline hit the local gossip columns on a Tuesday. Troubled former doctor working as nanny for billionaire's kids. What is she hiding? By Wednesday, more sensationalized stories emerged, each more vicious than the last. Margaret's past was dissected and distorted beyond recognition. The malpractice suit, which had been based on false allegations, was presented as fact. Her ex-husband, eager to twist the knife, gave an interview painting her as unstable and unfit to care for children. When Margaret arrived at the Triplets school for pickup that afternoon, whispers followed her. Other mothers pulled their children closer as she passed. The school principal approached her with a tight smile. "Miss Jefferson, may I have a word? There's been some concern from other parents about your background." Margaret stood frozen, the familiar feeling of her world collapsing returning. She had worked so hard to rebuild her life after everything fell apart. Now it was happening again. When she returned to the Anderson home with the Triplets, a grim-faced Steve was waiting. "My office, please," he said curtly. The Triplets watched with wide eyes as Margaret followed their father, their faces reflecting the fear that their world was about to be upended once more. In his office, Steve pushed a tablet across his desk. The screen displayed one of the articles. "Were you going to tell me about this?" Margaret lifted her chin. "Yes, when it became relevant. My past had no bearing on my ability to care for your children." "You were sued for malpractice." "I was falsely accused by a patient who was manipulated by my ex-husband," Margaret corrected. "I was fully cleared, but by then my reputation was destroyed. The suit was thrown out of court, but the damage was done." Steve ran a hand through his hair. "This puts me in an impossible position. The board is concerned about association with scandal. The school has called. Other parents are threatening to withdraw their children if the Triplets continue having contact with you." Margaret felt a familiar hollowness spread through her chest. "I see. You want me to leave." "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." She stood, dignity intact despite the chaos swirling around her. "I'll pack my things." As she turned to leave, Steve asked, "Did you come here knowing who I was? Was this some kind of revenge against the system that failed you?" The accusation stung more than Margaret expected. "No, Mr. Anderson, I came here because your children needed someone who understood their pain, nothing more." Upstairs, Margaret found the Triplets waiting in her room, their faces tear-streaked. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Emma asked, her voice breaking. Margaret knelt before them. "It looks that way, yes?" "Because of those stupid stories?" Leo demanded. "Dad can't make you go. We need you." "Sometimes adults have to make hard choices," Margaret explained gently. "Your father is trying to protect you." "From what?" Max cried. "You're the only one who made things better." Margaret gathered them close. "Listen to me. Whatever happens, remember what we've talked about. It's okay to miss your mom. It's okay to be sad or angry. And it's always, always okay to talk about how you feel." As she packed her bags, Margaret fought back her own tears. She had come to love these children as if they were her own. Leaving them felt like losing Zoe all over again. Downstairs, Steve watched through the window as Margaret loaded her suitcase into a taxi. The Triplets clung to her, sobbing openly. Even Mrs. Winters looked distressed, which struck Steve as odd, given how resistant the housekeeper had been to Margaret initially. As the taxi pulled away, a strange silence fell over the house. The Triplets retreated to their rooms, refusing to speak to their father. Steve returned to his office, trying to focus on work, but found himself staring at the family photo Margaret had encouraged him to put on his desk. His phone rang. Victor Reynolds again. The man had been calling incessantly over the past week, pushing for an answer on the merger proposal. Something about his persistence suddenly struck Steve as suspicious, especially in light of the timing of the stories about Margaret. On a hunch, Steve called his head of security. "I need you to look into something for me. Find out who's been feeding information to the press about our nanny. and check Victor Reynolds' communications while you're at it." 24 hours later, Steve had his answer. The security team had uncovered a trail of emails and payments, linking Victor to both the tabloid journalist and, more surprisingly, to Mrs. Winters, who had been reporting on the household dynamics for months. Further digging revealed Victor's elaborate scheme to take advantage of Steve's personal distraction to engineer a business takeover. The stories about Margaret had been the last desperate attempt to destabilize the Anderson household, just as Steve was regaining his focus. Steve sat back in his chair, anger and regret washing over him. He had sent away the one person who had helped heal his family, all because he feared scandal more than he valued truth. The triplets hadn't spoken to him since Margaret left. Their silence was a crushing indictment of his failure, once again, to protect what really mattered. Margaret had retreated to her small apartment in Rogers Park, the neighborhood where she had rebuilt her modest life after losing everything. The walls felt closer than she remembered, the silence deafening after months in the lively Anderson household. A knock at her door roused her from her thoughts. She opened it to find all three Anderson triplets, with Steve standing behind them looking both sheepish and determined. "What are you doing here?" she asked, stunned. Emma thrust a hand-drawn card forward. "We're sorry people were mean about you." Leo nodded earnestly. "Dad found out it was all because of some jerk who wanted to steal his company." "And Mrs. Winters was a spy," Max added dramatically. "Dad fired her." Margaret looked past them to Steve, who met her gaze steadily. "May we come in? We have a proposition for you." Once they were settled in her small living room, Steve explained everything. Victor's scheme, Mrs. Winters' betrayal, and his own realization that he had made a terrible mistake. "The thing is," he concluded, "the children need you. I fired Victor instead of accepting his merger. I issued a public statement clearing your name and explaining the false allegations. And he hesitated, I need you too. Not just as a nanny, as someone who reminds me what matters." Margaret looked at the hopeful faces of the triplets, then back at Steve. "This pattern can't continue. You can't push people away every time you're afraid." "I know," Steve acknowledged. "That's why I'm here asking you to come back, not as an employee, but as family. Whatever that means to you." "It means staying even when things get hard," Emma said with 6-year-old wisdom. "It means talking about Mom without getting sad mad," Leo added. "It means no more secrets," Max concluded. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. "No more secrets," she agreed, "and no more running from pain." Steve reached for her hand. "Come home with us, Margaret. Please." 1 year later, the Anderson mansion was transformed. Photographs of Catherine shared wall space with new family memories, including pictures of Margaret, who had become so much more than a nanny. The triplets, now 7 and thriving in school, had traded their reputation as demon children for new identities as creative, occasionally mischievous, but fundamentally kind kids who helped new students feel welcome. Steve had restructured his company to allow more family time, establishing a foundation in Catherine's name to support children dealing with grief, with Margaret as its director, utilizing her professional background once more. Victor Reynolds had faced legal consequences for his corporate espionage and manipulation. The experience had taught Steve valuable lessons about trust and priorities that transformed his approach to both business and parenting. As for Margaret, she had found something she never expected, a second chance at family, at purpose, at healing. In helping the Andersons confront their grief, she had finally processed her own. Zoe's memory no longer brought only pain, but also gratitude for the lessons her short life had taught. On a warm September evening, as the family gathered on the back patio for a barbecue, Emma looked up from her plate with a sudden thought. "Belinda, remember how you told us that first day that you'd stay until we graduated college?" Margaret smiled. "I do remember that." "Did you mean it?" Leo asked. Margaret looked at Steve, whose eyes held a question of his own, one he'd been working up the courage to ask. "Actually," she said, "I was thinking of staying even longer than that." and in that moment, surrounded by the family she had helped heal, and who had in turn healed her. Margaret knew that sometimes the greatest revenge against a cruel past is to build a beautiful future from its ruins.